The Ant and the Dove by Aesop and J.H. Stickney. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. The Ant and the Dove. An ant walking by the river one day said to himself, "How nice and cool this water looks. I must drink some of it." But as he began to drink, his foot slipped and he fell in. "Oh, somebody please help me or I shall drown," he cried. A dove sitting in a tree that overhung the river heard him and threw him a leaf. "Climb up on that leaf," said she, "and you will float ashore." The ant climbed up onto the leaf, which the wind blew to the shore, and he stepped upon dry land again. "Goodbye, kind dove," said he, as he ran home. "You have saved my life, and I wish I could do something for you." "Goodbye," said the dove. "Be careful not to fall in again." A few days after this, when the dove was busy building her nest, the ant saw a man just raising his gun to shoot her. He ran quickly and bit the man's leg so hard that he cried, "Oh! Oh!" and dropped his gun. This startled the dove, and she flew away. The man picked up his gun and walked on. When he was gone, the dove came back to her nest. "Thank you, my little friend," she said. "You have saved my life." And the little ant was overjoyed to think he had been able to do for the dove what the dove had so lately done for him. End of The Ant and the Dove, Aesop's Fables by J.H. Stickney. Read by Jean P. The Crow and the Pitcher by Aesop and J.H. Stickney. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. The Crow and the Pitcher. A thirsty crow once spied a pitcher and flew to it to see if by chance there was any water in it. When she looked in, she saw that there was water, but that it was so far from the top that she could not reach it, though she stretched her neck as far as she could. She stopped and thought to herself, "How shall I get that water? I am perishing with thirst, and there must be some way for me to get some of it." Some pebbles were lying on the ground, and, picking them up in her beak, she dropped them one by one into the pitcher. They sank to the bottom, and at last the water was pushed up by them to the top, so that the crow could easily drink it. "Where there's a will, there's a way," said the crow. End of The Crow and the Pitcher, Aesop's Fables by J.H. Stickney. Read by Jean P. The Dog and His Shadow by Aesop and J.H. Stickney. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. The Dog and His Shadow. A dog once had a nice piece of meat for his dinner. Some say that it was stolen, but others that it had been given him by a butcher, which we hope was the case. Dogs like best to eat at home, and he went trotting along with the meat in his mouth, as happy as a king. On the dog's way there was a stream with a plank across it. As the water was still and clear, he stopped to take a look at it. What should he see as he gazed into its bright depths but a dog as big as himself, looking up at him, and lo, the dog had meat in his mouth. "I'll try to get that," said he. "Then with both mine and his, what a feast I shall have." As quick as he thought, he snapped at the meat, but in doing so he had to open his mouth, and his own piece fell to the bottom of the stream. Then he saw that the other dog had lost his piece too. He went sadly home. In trying to grasp a shadow, he lost his substance. End of The Dog and His Shadow, Aesop's Fables by J.H. Stickney. Read by Jean P.
For the Fairest by Norma Bright Carson. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. You have all heard of the famous walls of Troy. Many years ago, Troy was a beautiful city. It was situated in Asia Minor, opposite Greece. Its king was called Priam, and he had one son named Hector, and a much younger son who was known as Paris. The daughter of Priam was Cassandra, and she was what in those days they called a seer. In other words, she could look into the future and tell what was going to happen. Now, when the baby Prince Paris was born, Cassandra told how that he would one day bring dreadful misfortune to his family. Therefore, instead of bringing the young prince up in the palace, the family sent him away at an early age to live in the country, and as he grew up he was trained to be a shepherd. So Paris wandered over the hillsides of Mount Ida and tended his flocks. Just about this time, all the gods and goddesses of Greece were invited to a wedding. Only one goddess was not asked. This was Discord, and great was her indignation when she found that she was not to be among the wedding guests. Discord determined to have her revenge on those who had offended her. On the day of the marriage, she hid herself near the place where the feast was to be. While the guests were wandering happily among the groves and enjoying the good things provided for them, Discord crept in among them. Suddenly she lifted up her hand and threw something into the very midst of the assembled company. Everybody clamored for it, and when it was picked up, it was found to be an apple, all of gold, and on it were inscribed these words, "For the Fairest." You can well imagine the excitement that followed. There were many beautiful goddesses present, and each thought herself entitled to the prize. After much argument, however, the choice narrowed down to three. These were Juno, the queen of the gods, Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, and Venus, the goddess of love. None of these three would consent to give the apple to either of the other two. Finally, someone made the suggestion that the choice be left to a mortal. After more discussion, it was decided that the young shepherd, known as Paris, should say to which goddess the apple should go. Thereupon Minerva, Juno, and Venus sought out Paris where he tended his sheep, and each made him wonderful promises as to what she would give him should he award her the apple. Juno promised to make him wealthy and powerful. Minerva promised him great fame as a warrior. Venus said to him in her most charming way, "If you will give me the apple, I will get for you the most beautiful woman in the world for your wife." The last promise was too great a temptation for the young shepherd, and he decided that Venus deserved the apple marked "For the Fairest." In this way a great trouble was brought upon the city of Troy, for the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, the wife of Menelaus, the king of Sparta. In the years before Helen was married, all the warriors of Greece had tried to win her. When at last she chose Menelaus for her husband, her other suitors took a vow that should she ever, for any cause, leave Menelaus, they would go anywhere to fight in order to bring her back. Now when Paris was told by Venus to go to Sparta after Helen, he first went back to Troy. There his family tried to persuade him to remain at home, because they knew that his attempt to win Helen would only mean a war with the Greeks for themselves. But Paris persisted in going his own way. Arrived in Sparta, Paris was received by Menelaus as an honored guest, but he was very ungratefully set about at once to persuade Helen to return to Troy with him. Helen, who was as vain as she was beautiful, was fascinated by the handsome young prince and his eager love-making, and soon consented to go away with him. When Menelaus discovered that his guest had left and that his wife was also gone, he was furious. He called together all his allies. Among these were Ulysses, Achilles, and Agamemnon. Somehow the enthusiasm with which these various heroes had promised their aid to Menelaus should Helen not prove faithful had lessened. Ulysses was happily married and had a son. He was not so keen on leaving his home. The father and mother of Achilles did not desire him to go to war at all, and Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae, was very much occupied with other affairs. However, at the call of Menelaus, they came to Sparta and held a council of war. At this council they decided to take an army to the plains that lay around the city of Troy. Then they would besiege the city, and if they were victorious, the mighty walls of Troy should fall, and with them should go down to death the house of Priam and the unfaithful woman who had deserted her husband. End of For the Fairest by Norma Bright Carson. Read by BettyB.
The Fox and the Lion by Aesop and J.H. Stickney. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Fox and the Lion. A little fox was out playing one day when a lion came roaring along. "Dear me," said the fox as he hid behind a tree. "I never saw a lion before. What a terrible creature! His voice makes me tremble." The next time the fox met the lion, he was not so much afraid, but he kept a safe distance and said to himself, "I wish he would not make such a noise." The third time they met, the fox was not frightened at all. He ran up to the lion and said, "What are you roaring about?" And the lion was so taken by surprise that without saying a word, he let the fox walk away. It would not be safe for little foxes always to follow the example of this one, but it is often true that what our fear makes seem a lion in the way has no danger in it if we meet it bravely. End of The Fox and the Lion, Aesop's Fables by J.H. Stickney. Read by Jean P.
Hans the Hedgehog by the Brothers Grimm. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Annie Mars. Hans the Hedgehog. There once was a countryman who had money and land in plenty, but how rich soever he was, one thing was still wanting in his happiness. He had no children. Often when he went into town with the other peasants, they mocked him and asked why he had no children. At last he became angry, and when he got home he said, "I will have a child, even if it be a hedgehog." Then his wife had a child that was a hedgehog in the upper part of his body and a boy in the lower. And when she saw the child, she was terrified and said, "See, there thou hast brought ill luck upon us." Then said the man, "What can be done now? The boy must be christened, but we shall not be able to get a godfather for him." The woman said, "And we cannot call him anything else but Hans the Hedgehog." When he was christened, the parson said he cannot go into any ordinary bed because of his spikes. So a little straw was put behind the stove, and Hans the Hedgehog was laid on it. His mother could not suckle him, for he would have pricked her with his quills. So he lay there behind the stove for 8 years, and his father was tired of him and thought, if he would but die. He did not die, however, but remained lying there. How it happened that there was a fair in the town, and the peasant was about to go to it, and asked his wife what he should bring back with him for her. "A little meat and a couple of white rolls which are wanted for the house," said she. Then he asked the servant, and she wanted a pair of slippers and some stockings with clocks. At last he said also, "And what wilt thou have, Hans my Hedgehog?" "Dear father," he said, "do bring me bagpipes." When therefore the father came home again, he gave his wife what he had brought for her, meat and white rolls, and then he gave the maid the slippers and the stockings with clocks, and lastly he went behind the stove and gave Hans the Hedgehog the bagpipes. And when Hans the Hedgehog had the bagpipes, he said, "Dear father, do go to the forge and get the cock shod, and then I will ride away and never come back again." On this The father was delighted to think that he was going to get rid of him, and had the cock shod for him. And when it was done, Hans the Hedgehog got on it and rode away, but took swine and asses with him, which he intended to keep in the forest. When they got there, he made the cock fly onto a high tree with him, and there he sat for many a long year, and watched his asses and swine until the herd was quite large, and his father knew nothing about him. While he was sitting in the tree, however, he played his bagpipes, and he made music which was very beautiful. Once a king came travelling by who had lost his way and heard the music. He was astonished at it, and sent his servant forth to look all round and see from where hence this music came. He spied about, but saw nothing but a little animal sitting up aloft on the tree, which looked like a cock with a hedgehog on it, which made this music. Then the king told the servant he was to ask why he sat there, and if he knew the road which led to his kingdom. So Hans the Hedgehog descended from the tree, and said he would show the way if the king would write a bond, and promise him whatever he first met in the royal courtyard as soon as he arrived at home. Then the king thought, "I can easily do that. Hans the Hedgehog understands nothing, and I can write what I like." So the king took pen and ink and wrote something, and when he was done, Hans the Hedgehog showed him the way, and he got safely home. But his daughter, when she saw him from afar, was so overjoyed that she ran to meet him and kissed him. Then he remembered Hans the Hedgehog, and told her what had happened, and that he had been forced to promise whatsoever first met him when he got home, and to a very strange animal which sat on a cock as if it were a horse, and made beautiful music, but that instead of writing that he should have what he wanted, he had written that he should not have it. Thereupon the princess was glad, and said he had done well, for she never would have gone away with the hedgehog. Hans the Hedgehog, however, looked after his asses and pigs, and was always merry, and sat on the tree and played his bagpipes. Now it came to pass that another king came journeying by with his attendants and runners, and he also had lost his way, and did not know how to get home again, because the forest was so large. He likewise heard the beautiful music from a distance, and asked his runner what that could be, and told him to go and see. Then the runner went under the tree, and saw the cock sitting at the top of it, and Hans the Hedgehog on the cock. The runner asked him what he was about up there. "I am keeping my asses and my pigs, but what is your desire?" The messenger said that they had lost their way, and could not get back into their own kingdom, and asked if he would not show them the way. Then Hans the Hedgehog got down the tree with the cock, and told the aged king that he would show him the way, if he would give him for his own whatsoever first met him in front of his royal palace. The king said yes, and wrote a promise to Hans the Hedgehog that he should have this. That done, Hans rode on before him on the cock, and pointed out the way, and the king reached his kingdom again in safety. When he got to the courtyard, there were great rejoicing. Now he had an only daughter, who was very beautiful. She ran to meet him, threw her arms around his neck, and was delighted to have her old father back again. She asked him where in the world he had been so long. So he told her how he had lost his way, and had very nearly not come back at all, but that as he was travelling through the great forest, a creature, half hedgehog, half man, who was sitting astride a cock in a high tree and making music, had shown him the way, and helped him to get out, but that in return he had promised him whatsoever first met him in the royal courtyard, and how that was she herself, which made him unhappy now. But on this she promised that, for love of her father, she would go willingly with this Hans if he came. Hans the Hedgehog, however, took care of his pigs, and the pigs multiplied until they became so many in number that the whole forest was filled with them. Then Hans the Hedgehog resolved not to live in the forest any longer, and sent word to his father to have every sty in the village emptied, for he was coming with such a great herd that all might kill who wished to do so. When his father heard that, he was troubled, for he thought Hans the Hedgehog had died long ago. Hans the Hedgehog, however, seated himself on the cock and drove the pigs before him into the village, and ordered the slaughter to begin. Ha! But there was still a killing and chopping that might have been heard 2 miles off. After this, Hans the Hedgehog said, "Father, let me have the cock shod once more at the forge, and then I will ride away and never come back for as long as I live." Then the father had the cock shod once more, and was pleased that Hans the Hedgehog would never return again. Hans the Hedgehog rode away to the first kingdom. There the king had commanded that whosoever came mounted on a cock and had bagpipes with him should be shot at, cut down, or stabbed by everyone, so that he might not enter the palace. When therefore Hans the Hedgehog came riding thither, they all pressed forward against him with their pikes, but he spurred the cock, and it flew up over the gate in front of the king's window, and lighted there. And Hans cried that the king must give him what he had promised, or he would take both his life and his daughter's. Then the king began to speak, his daughter fair, and to beg her to go away with Hans in order to save her own life and her father's. So she dressed herself in white, and her father gave her a carriage with 6 horses and magnificent attendants, together with gold and possession. She seated herself in the carriage, and placed Hans the Hedgehog beside her, with the cock and the bagpipes, and then they took leave and drove away. And the king thought he should never see her again. He was, however, deceived in his expectation, for when they were a short distance from the town, Hans the Hedgehog took her pretty clothes off, and pierced her with his hedgehog skin until she bled all over. "This is the reward of your falseness," he said. "Go your way, I will not have you." And on that he chased her home again, and she was disgraced for the rest of her life. Hans the Hedgehog, however, rode on further on the cock with his bagpipes to the dominions of the second king to whom he had shown the way. This one, however, had arranged that if anyone resembling Hans the Hedgehog should come, they were to present arms, give him safe conduct, cry long life to him, and lead him to the royal palace. But when the king's daughter saw him, she was terrified, for he looked quite too strange. She remembered, however, that she could not change her mind, for she had given her promise to her father. So Hans the Hedgehog was welcomed by her, and married to her, and had to go with her to the royal table, and she seated herself by his side, and they ate and drank. When the evening came, and they wanted to go to sleep, she was afraid of his quills, and he told her that she was not to fear, for no harm would befall her. And he told the old king that he was to appoint 4 men to watch by the door of the chamber, and light a great fire. And when he entered the room, and was about to get into bed, he would creep out of his hedgehog skin, and leave it lying there by the bedside, and that the men were to run nimbly to it, throw it into the fire, and stay by it until it was consumed. When the clock struck 11, he went into the chamber, stripped off the hedgehog skin, and left it lying by the bed. Then came the men, and fetched it swiftly, and threw it into the fire. And when the fire had consumed it, he was delivered, and lay there in the bed in human form, but he was coal black as if he had been burnt. The king sent for his physician, who washed him with precious salves, and anointed him, and he became white, and was a handsome young man. When the king's daughter saw that, she was glad, and the next morning they arose joyfully, ate and drank, and then the marriage was properly solemnized, and Hans the Hedgehog received the kingdom from the aged king. When several years had passed, he went with his wife to his father, and said that he was his son. The father, however, declared he had no son. He had never had but one, and he had been born like a hedgehog with spikes, and had gone forth into the world. Then Hans made himself known, and the old father rejoiced and went with him to his kingdom. My tale is done, and away it has run to little August's house. End of Hans the Hedgehog by the Brothers Grimm. Read by Annie Mars.
How Jack Went Out to Seek His Fortune by Arthur Rackham, retold by Flora Annie Steele. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Once on a time, there was a boy named Jack, and one morning he started to go and seek his fortune. He didn't gone very far before he met a cat. "Where are you going, Jack?" said the cat. "I am going to seek my fortune. May I go with you?" "Yes," said Jack. "The more the merrier." So on they went, Jack and the cat, jiggly jolt, jiggly jolt, jiggly jolt. They went a little further and they met a dog. "Where are you going, Jack?" said the dog. "I am going to seek my fortune. May I go with you?" "Yes," said Jack. "The more the merrier." So they went, Jack, the cat, and the dog. Jiggly jolt, jiggly jolt, jiggly jolt. They went a little further, and they met a goat. "Where are you going, Jack?" said the goat. "I am going to seek my fortune. May I go with you?" "Yes," said Jack. "The more the merrier." So on they went, Jack, the cat, the dog, and the goat. Jiggly jolt, jiggly jolt, jiggly jolt. They went a little further, and they met a bull. "Where are you going, Jack?" said the bull. "I am going to seek my fortune. May I go with you?" "Yes," said Jack. "The more the merrier." So on they went, Jack, the cat, the dog, the goat, and the bull. Jiggly jolt, jiggly jolt, jiggly jolt. They went a little further, and they met a rooster. "Where are you going, Jack?" said the rooster. "I am going to seek my fortune. May I go with you?" "Yes," said Jack. "The more the merrier." So on they went, Jack, the cat, the dog, the goat, the bull, and the rooster. Jiggly jolt, jiggly jolt, jiggly jolt. And they went on jiggly jolting till it was about dark, and it was time to think of some place where they could spend the night. Now, after a bit, they came in sight of a house, and Jack told his companions to keep still while he went up and looked in through the window to see if all was safe. And what did he see through the window but a band of robbers seated at a table counting over great bags of gold. "That gold shall be mine," quoth Jack to himself. "I have found my fortune already." Then he went back and told his companions to wait till he gave the word, and then to make all the noise they possibly could in their own fashion. So when they were all ready, Jack gave the word, and the cat mewed, and the dog barked, and the goat bleated, and the bull bellowed, and the rooster crowed, and all together they made such a terrific hubbub that the robbers jumped up in a fright and ran away, leaving their gold on the table. So, after a good laugh, Jack and his companions went in and took possession of the house and the gold. Now Jack was a wise boy, and he knew that the robbers would come back in the dead of the night to get their gold. And so, when it came time to go to bed, he put the cat in the rocking chair, and he put the dog under the table, and he put the goat upstairs, and he put the bull in the cellar, and bade the rooster fly up on the roof. Then he went to bed. Now sure enough, in the dead of the night, the robbers sent one man back to the house to look after their money. But before long he came back in a great fright and told them a fearsome tale. "I went back to the house," said he, "and went in and tried to sit down in the rocking chair, and there was an old woman knitting there, and she, oh my, stuck her knitting needles into me. That was a cat, you know. Then I went to the table to look after the money, but there was a shoemaker under the table, and my, how he stuck his awl into me. That was a duck, you know. So I started to go upstairs, but there was a man up there threshing, and goody, how he knocked me down with his flail. That was the goat, you know. Then I started to go down to the cellar, but oh dear me, there was a man down there chopping wood, and he knocked me up, and he knocked me down, just terrible with his axe. That was the brawl, you know. But I shouldn't have minded all that if it hadn't been for an awful little fellow on the top of the house by the kitchen chimney, who kept a hollering and hollering, "Cook him in a stew, cook him in a stew, cook him in a stew." And that, of course, was a cock-a-doodle-doo. Then the robbers agreed that they would rather lose their gold than meet with such a fate. So they made off, and Jack next morning went gaily home with his booty, and each of the animals carried a portion of it. The cat hung back on its tail. A cat when it walks always carries its tail stuffed. The dog on his collar, the goat and the bull on their horns, but Jack made the rooster carry a golden guinea in its beak to prevent it from calling all the time, "Cock-a-doodle-doo, cook him in a stew." The end of How Jack Went Out to Seek His Fortune by Arthur Rackham, retold by Flora Annie Steele, read by Shahd.
Jack Frost's Cousin by Carolyn Sherwin Bailey. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. That cold morning in January, Big Jack Frost got up out of the wrong side of his bed in his castle of ice and snow. "There's a boy I know who says he isn't afraid of me," said Big Jack Frost in his hardest, chilliest, sharp as icicles kind of voice, "and this morning I intend to show him a thing or two." And with that, Jack Frost put on his ice helmet, his snow overcoat, and his 7-league snowshoes that were shod with icicles. Then he started down the hills and across the valleys until he came to the town of Happy Hollow, where this brave boy lived. The boy, whose name was Jack, was at breakfast. It was Saturday morning, with a long play day ahead. "I'll spoil his play," said Big Jack Frost. "I'll make the air so frosty that it'll freeze his ears." So Jack Frost made the Saturday morning air cold enough to freeze Jack's ears. "Woo-wee, it's cold," said Jack as he looked out of the kitchen door. "But I don't mind that. I will put on my cap that comes down over my ears." "Well," thought Jack Frost, "I can at least freeze that boy's nose." And with that, Jack Frost made the Saturday morning air so very freezing cold that it nipped Jack's nose. "I'm glad Mother knitted me this muffler," said Jack as he pulled his warm, thick woolen muffler up to keep his cold nose warm. "I don't mind this weather at all." And down to the gate went Jack. Then Big Jack Frost was very angry. "I will spoil the brook for that boy," he said. "I will make it so hard and so slippery and so cold that he can't play there." So Jack Frost covered the Singing Brook with a thick roof of glaring ice. "Now," he thought to himself as he watched the boy going down through the snowy meadow to the brook, "he can't sail boats or skip stones in his brook today or for a number of days." But Jack had his new skates slung over his shoulder. He did not know how to skate, for he was only 7 years old, but he was going to try and learn. He strapped on his skates and started off. He didn't mind a few bumps when he fell down. Up he got and started off again. More ice, thought Big Jack Frost, and smoother, more slippery ice. So Jack Frost iced the brook as it had never been frozen over. It was sparkling, cold, glary ice. One had to skate fast to keep up and to keep from freezing. But Jack could balance himself better now on his skates, and a little girl he knew brought him a ball and a hockey stick to play with. He had to skate very fast to follow the ball as it rolled along the ice. It was fun. Jack was as warm as could be. His cheeks were rosy, and he liked the cold. "Who's afraid of Jack Frost?" he shouted as he glided over the ice. "Who's laughing at you, Jack Frost?" tinkled the icicles on the trees as Big Jack Frost took his way home to his castle that night. "Who's laughing at you, Jack Frost?" creaked the snow. "Who is laughing at you, Jack Frost?" snapped the icy crust on the fields. The whole winter knew that something had happened to make Big Jack Frost feel uncomfortable, for the cold air rang and echoed with the voices of the children at play. Big Jack Frost knew that he must say something. He had found out that he was not really so important a giant as he thought he was. "Oh, it doesn't matter about that," Jack Frost said. "It's only a young cousin of mine named Jack. Of course I can't expect my cousin to be afraid of me." But deep down in his icy large heart, Jack Frost knew that he had found a boy who really liked the cold. End of Jack Frost's Cousin by Carolyn Sherwin Bailey. Read by Colleen McMahon.
The Island of the Nine Whirlpools by Edith Nesbit. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Island of the Nine Whirlpools. The dark arch that led to the witch's cave was hung with a black and yellow fringe of live snakes. As the queen went in, keeping carefully in the middle of the arch, all the snakes lifted their wicked flat heads and stared at her with their wicked yellow eyes. You know, it's not good manners to stare, even at royalty, except, of course, for cats. And the snakes had been so badly brought up that they even put their tongues out at the poor lady. Nasty, thin, sharp tongues they were, too. Now, the queen's husband was, of course, the king. And besides being a king, he was an enchanter, and considered to be quite at the top of his profession. So he was very wise, and he knew that when kings and queens want children, the queen always goes to see a witch. So he gave the queen the witch's address, and the queen called on her, though she was very frightened and did not like it at all. The witch was sitting by a fire of sticks, stirring something bubbly in a shiny copper cauldron. "What do you want, my dear?" she said to the queen. "Oh, if you please," said the queen. "I want a baby, a very nice one. We don't want any expense spared. My husband said—" "Oh, yes," said the witch. "I know all about him. And so you want a child. Do you know it will bring you sorrow?" "It will bring me joy first," said the queen. "Great sorrow," said the witch. "Greater joy," said the queen. Then the witch said, "Well, have your own way. I suppose it's as much as your place is worth to go back without it." "The king would be very much annoyed," said the poor queen. "Well, well," said the witch. "What will you give me for the child?" "Anything you ask for, and all I have," said the queen. "Then give me your gold crown." The queen took it off quickly. "And your necklace of blue sapphires." The queen unfastened it. "And your pearl bracelets." The queen unclasped them. "And your ruby clasps." And the queen undid the clasps. "Now the lilies from your breast." The queen gathered together the lilies. "And the diamonds of your little bright shoe buckles." The queen pulled off her shoes. Then the witch stirred the stuff that was in the cauldron, and one by one she threw in the gold crown, and the sapphire necklace, and the pearl bracelets, and the ruby clasps, and the diamonds of the little bright shoe buckles. And last of all, she threw in the lilies. The stuff in the cauldron boiled up in foaming flashes of yellow and blue and red and white and silver, and sent out a sweet scent. And presently the witch poured it out into a pot and set it to cool in the doorway among the snakes. Then she said to the queen, "Your child will have hair as golden as your crown, eyes as blue as your sapphires. The red of your rubies will lie on its lips, and its skin will be clear and pale as your pearls. Its soul will be white and sweet as your lilies, and your diamonds will be no clearer than its wits." "Oh, thank you, said the queen. "And when will it come?" "You will find it when you get home." "And won't you have something for yourself?" asked the queen. "Any little thing you fancy. Would you like a country or a sack of jewels?" "Nothing, thank you," said the witch. "I could make more diamonds in a day than I should wear in a year." "Well, but do let me do some little thing for you," the queen went on. "Aren't you tired of being a witch? Wouldn't you like to be a duchess or a princess or something like that?" "There is one thing I should rather like," said the witch, "but it's hard to get in my trade." "Oh, tell me what," said the queen. "I should like someone to love me," said the witch. Then the queen threw her arms around the witch's neck and kissed her 100 times. "Why," she said, "I love you better than my life. You've given me the baby, and the baby shall love you too." "Perhaps it will," said the witch, "and when the sorrow comes, send for me. Each of your 50 kisses will be a spell to bring me to you. Now drink up your medicine, there's a dear, and run along home." So the queen drank the stuff in the pot, which was quite cool by this time, and she went out under the fringe of snakes, and they all behaved like good Sunday school children. Some of them even tried to drop a curtsy to her as she went by, though that is not easy when you are hanging wrong way up by your tail. But the snakes knew the queen was friends with their mistress, so, of course, they had to do their best to be civil. When the queen got home, sure enough, there was a baby laying in the cradle with the royal arms blazoned on it, crying as naturally as possible. It had pink ribbons to tie up its sleeves, so the queen saw at once it was a girl. When the king knew this, he tore his black hair with fury. "Oh, you silly, silly queen," he said. "Why didn't I marry a clever lady? Did you think I went to all the trouble and expense of sending you to a witch to get a girl? You know well enough it was a boy I wanted, a boy, an heir, a prince, to learn all my magic and my enchantments, and to rule the kingdom after me. I'll bet a crown, my crown," he said. "You never even thought to tell the witch what kind you wanted, did you now?" And the queen hung her head and had to confess that she had only asked for a child. "Very well, madam," said the king. "Very well. Have your own way, and make the most of your daughter while she's a child." The queen did. All the years of her life had never held half so much happiness as now lived in each of the moments when she held her little baby in her arms. And the years went on, and the king grew more and more clever at magic and more disagreeable at home, and the princess grew more beautiful and more dear every day she lived. The queen and the princess were feeding the goldfish in the courtyard fountains with crumbs of the princess's 18th birthday cake when the king came into the courtyard, looking as black as thunder, with his black raven hopping after him. He shook his fist at his family, as indeed he generally did whenever he met them, for he was not a king with pretty home manners. The raven sat down on the edge of the marble basin and tried to peck the goldfish. It was all he could do to show that he was in the same temper as his master. "A girl indeed," said the king angrily. "I wonder you can dare to look me in the face when you remember how your silliness has spoiled everything." "You oughtn't to speak to my mother like that," said the princess. She was 18, and it came to her suddenly and all in a moment that she was a grown-up, so she spoke out. The king could not utter a word for several minutes. He was too angry, but the queen said, "My dear child, don't interfere," quite crossly, for she was frightened. And to her husband she said, "My dear, why do you go on worrying about it? Our daughter is not a boy, it's true, but she may marry a clever man who could rule your kingdom after you and learn as much magic as ever you cared to teach him." Then the king found his tongue. "If she does marry," he said slowly, "her husband will have to be a very clever man. Oh, yes, very clever indeed. And he will have to know a very great deal more magic than I shall ever care to teach him." The queen knew at once by the king's tone that he was going to be disagreeable. "Ah," she said, "don't punish the child because she loves her mother." "I'm not going to punish her for that," said he. "I'm only going to teach her to respect her father." And without another word he went off to his laboratory and worked all night, boiling different colored things in crucibles and copying charms in curious twisted letters from old brown books with mold stain on their yellow pages. The next day his plan was all arranged. He took the poor princess to the Lone Tower, which stands on an island in the sea, 1,000 miles from everywhere. He gave her a dowry and settled a handsome income on her. He engaged a competent dragon to look after her, and also a respectable griffin whose birth and upbringing he knew all about. And he said, "Here you shall stay, my dear, respectful daughter, till the clever man comes to marry you. He'll have to be clever enough to sail a ship through the 9 whirlpools that spin around the island, and to kill the dragon and the griffin. Till he comes, you'll never get any older or any wiser. No doubt he will soon come. You can employ yourself in embroidering your wedding gown. I wish you joy, my dutiful child." And his carriage, drawn by live thunderbolts, thunder travels very fast, rose in the air and disappeared. And the poor princess was left with the dragon and the griffin on the island of the 9 whirlpools. The queen, left at home, cried for a day and a night, and then she remembered the witch and called to her. And the witch came, and the queen told her all. "For the sake of the twice 25 kisses you gave me," said the witch, "I will help you. But it is the last thing I can do, and it is not much. Your daughter is under a spell, and I can take you to her. But if I do, you will have to be turned to stone, and to stay so till the spell is taken off the child." "I would be a stone for 1,000 years," said the poor queen, if at the end of them I could see my dear again." So the witch took the queen in a carriage drawn by live sunbeams, which traveled more quickly than anything else in the world, and much quicker than thunder. And so away and away to the lone tower on the island of the 9 whirlpools. And there was the princess sitting on the floor in the best room of the lone tower, crying as if her heart would break, and the dragon and the griffin were sitting primly on each side of her. "Oh, mother, mother, mother," she cried, and hung around the queen's neck as if she would never let go. "Now," said the witch, when they had all cried as much as was good for them, "I can do 1 or 2 other little things for you. Time shall not make the princess sad. All days will be like one day till her deliverer comes. And you and I, dear queen, will sit in stone at the gate of the tower. In doing this for you, I lose all my witch's powers, and when I say the spell that changes you to stone, I shall change with you. And if ever we come out of the stone, I shall be a witch no more, but only a happy old woman." Then the 3 kissed one another again and again, and the witch said the spell, and on each side of the door there was now a stone lady. One of them had a stone crown on its head and a stone scepter in its hand, but the other held a stone tablet with words on it, which the griffin and the dragon could not read, though they had both had a very good education. And now all days seemed like one day to the princess, and the next day always seemed the day when her mother would come out of the stone and kiss her again. And the years went slowly by, the wicked king died, and someone else took his kingdom. And many things were changed in the world, but the island did not change, nor the 9 whirlpools, nor the griffin, nor the dragon, nor the 2 stone ladies. And all the time, from the very first, the day of the princess's deliverance was coming, creeping nearer and nearer and nearer. But no one saw it coming except the princess, and she only in dreams. And the years went by in 10s and in 100s, and still the 9 whirlpools spun around, roaring in triumph the story of many a good ship that had gone down in their swirl, bearing with it some prince who had tried to win the princess and her dowry. And the great sea knew all the other stories of the princes who had come from very far and had seen the whirlpools, and had shaken their wise young heads and said, "'Bout ship," and gone discreetly home to their nice, safe, comfortable kingdoms. But no one told the story of the deliverer who was to come, and the years went by. Now, after more scores of years than you would like to add up on your slate, a certain sailor boy sailed on the high seas with his uncle, who was a skilled skipper. And the boy could reef a sail and coil a rope and keep the ship's nose steady before the wind. And he was as good a boy as you could find in a month of Sundays, and worthy to be a prince. Now there is something which is wiser than all the world, and it knows when people are worthy to be princes. And this something came from the farther side of the 7th world and whispered in the boy's ear. And the boy heard, though he did not know he heard, and he looked out over the black sea with the white foam horses galloping over it, and far away he saw a light. And he said to the skipper, his uncle, "What light is that?" Then the skipper said, "All good things defend you, Nigel, from sailing near that light. It's not mentioned in all charts, but it is marked in the old chart I steer by, which was my father's fathers before me, and his father's father before him. It is the light that shines from the lone tower that stands above the 9 whirlpools. And when my father's father was young, he heard from the very old man, his great-great-grandfather, that in that tower an enchanted princess, fairer than the day, waits to be delivered. But there is no deliverance, so never steer that way, and think no more of the princess, for that is only an idle tale. But the whirlpools are quite real. So, of course, from that day Nigel thought of nothing else, and as he sailed hither and thither upon the high seas, he saw from time to time the light that shone out to the sea across the wild swirl of the 9 whirlpools. And one night, when the ship was at anchor and the skipper asleep in his bunk, Nigel launched the ship's boat and steered alone over the dark sea towards the light. He dared not go very near till daylight should show him what, indeed, were the whirlpools he had to dread. But when the dawn came, he saw the lone tower, standing dark against the pink and primrose of the east, and about its base the sullen swirl of black water, and he heard the wonderful roar of it. So he hung off and on all that day, and for 6 days besides. And when he had watched 7 days, he knew something. For you are certain to know something if you give for 7 days your whole thought to it, even though it be only the first declension, or the 9 times table, or the dates of the Norman kings. What he knew was this, that for 5 minutes out of the 1,440 minutes that make up the day, the whirlpools slipped into silence while the tide went down and left the yellow sand bare. And every day this happened, but every day it was 5 minutes earlier than it had been the day before. He made sure of this by the ship's chronometer, which he had thoughtfully brought with him. So on the 8th day, at 5 minutes before noon, Nigel got ready. And when the whirlpools suddenly stopped whirling and the tide sank like water in a basin that has a hole in it, he struck to his oars and put his back into his stroke and presently beached the boat on the yellow sand. Then he dragged it into a cave and sat down to wait. By 5 minutes and 1 second past noon, the whirlpools were black and busy again, and Nigel peeped out of his cave, and on the rocky ledge overhanging the sea he saw a princess as beautiful as the day, with golden hair and a green gown, and he went out to meet her. "I've come to save you," he said. "How darling and beautiful you are!" "You are very good and very clever and very dear," said the princess, smiling and giving him both her hands. He shed a little kiss on each hand before he let them go. "So now, when the tide is low again, I will take you away in my boat," he said. "But what about the dragon and the griffin?" asked the princess. "Dear me," said Nigel. "I didn't know about them. I suppose I can kill 'em." "Don't be a silly boy," said the princess, pretending to be very grown up, for though she had been on the island time only knows how many years, she was just 18, and she still liked pretending. "You haven't a sword or a shield or anything." "Well, don't the beasts ever go to sleep?" "Why, yes," said the princess, "but only once in 24 hours, and then the dragon is turned to stone." "But the griffin has dreams." "The griffin sleeps at tea time every day, but the dragon sleeps every day for 5 minutes, and every day it is 3 minutes later than it was the day before." "What time does he sleep today?" asked Nigel. "At 11, said the princess. "Ah," said Nigel, "can you do sums?" "No," said the princess sadly, "I was never good at them." "Then I must," said Nigel. "I can, but it's slow work, and it makes me very unhappy. It'll take me days and days." "Don't begin yet," said the princess. "You'll have plenty of time to be unhappy when I'm not with you. Tell me all about yourself." So he did, and then she told him all about herself. "I know I've been here a long time," she said, "but I don't know what time is, and I'm very busy sewing silk flowers on a golden gown for my wedding day. And the griffin does the housework. His wings are so convenient and feathery for sweeping and dusting. And the dragon does the cooking. He's hot inside, so of course it's no trouble to him. And though I don't know what time is, I'm sure it's time for my wedding day, because my golden gown only wants one more white daisy on the sleeve, and a lily on the bosom of it, and then it will be ready." Just then they heard a dry, rustling clatter on the rocks above them, and a snorting sound. "It's the dragon," said the princess hurriedly. "Goodbye. Be a good boy. Get your sum done." And she ran away and left him to his arithmetic. Now the sum was this: if the whirlpools stop and the tide goes down once in every 24 hours, and they do it 5 minutes earlier every 24 hours, and if the dragon sleeps every day, and he does it 3 minutes later every day, in how many days and at what time in the day will the tide go down 3 minutes before the dragon falls asleep? It is quite a simple sum, as you see. You could do it in a minute because you have been to a good school and have taken pains with your lessons. But it was quite otherwise with poor Nigel. He sat down to work out his sum with a piece of chalk on a smooth stone. He tried it by practice and the unitary method, by multiplication, and by rule of 3 3/4. He tried it by decimals and by compound interest. He tried it by square root and by cube root. He tried it by addition, simple and otherwise, and he tried it by mixed examples in vulgar fractions. But it was all of no use. Then he tried to do the sum by algebra, by simple and quadratic equations, by trigonometry, by logarithms, and by conic sections. But it would not do. He got an answer every time, it's true, but it was always a different one, and he could not feel sure which answer was right. And just as he was feeling how much more important than anything else it is to be able to do your sums, the princess came back, and now it was getting dark. "Why, you've been 7 hours over that sum," she said, "and you haven't done it yet. Look here, this is what is written on the tablet of the statue by the lower gate. It has figures in it. Perhaps it's the answer to the sum." She held out to him a big white magnolia leaf, and she had scratched on it with the pin of her pearl brooch, and it had turned brown where she had scratched it, as a magnolia leaf will do. Nigel read, "After 9 days, TII period 24 period, DII period 27, ANS period, P period S period, and the griffin is artificial period, R period." He clapped his hands softly. "Dear princess," he said, "I know that's the right answer. It says R, too, you see? But I'll just prove it." So he hastily worked the sum backwards in decimals and equations and conic sections and all the rules he could think of, and it came right every time. "So now we must wait," he said, and they waited. And every day the princess came to see Nigel and brought him food cooked by the dragon, and he lived in his cave and talked to her when she was there and thought about her when she was not, and they were both as happy as the longest day in summer. Then at last came the day. Nigel and the princess laid their plans. "You're sure he won't hurt you, my only treasure?" said Nigel. "Quite," said the princess. "I'll only wish I were half as sure as he wouldn't hurt you." "My princess," he said tenderly, "two great powers are on our side, the power of love and the power of arithmetic. Those two are stronger than anything else in the world." So when the tide began to go down, Nigel and the princess ran out onto the sands, and there, in full sight of the terrace where the dragon kept watch, Nigel took his princess in his arms and kissed her. The griffin was busy sweeping the stairs of the lone tower, but the dragon saw, and he gave a cry of rage, and it was like 20 engines all letting off steam at the top of their voices inside the Cannon Street station. And the two lovers stood looking up at the dragon. He was dreadful to look at. His head was white with age. His beard had grown so long that he caught his claws in it as he walked. His wings were white with the salt that had settled on them from the spray of the sea. His tail was long and thick and jointed and white, and had little legs to it, any number of them, far too many, so that it looked like a very large, fat silkworm. And his claws were as long as lessons and as sharp as bayonets. "Goodbye, love," cried Nigel, and ran out across the yellow sand toward the sea. He had one end of a cord tied to his arm. The dragon was clambering down the face of the cliff, and next moment he was crawling and withering and sprawling and wiggling across the beach after Nigel, making great holes in the sand with his heavy feet, and the very end of his tail, where there were no legs, made, as it dragged, a mark in the sand such as you make when you launch a boat. And he breathed fire till the wet sand hissed again, and the water of the little rock pools got quite frightened, and all went off in steam. Still Nigel held on, and the dragon after him. The princess could see nothing for the steam, and she stood crying bitterly, but still holding on tight with her right hand to the other end of the cord that Nigel had told her to hold, while with her left she held the ship's chronometer and looked at it through her tears as he had bidden her to look, so as to know when to pull the rope. On went Nigel over the sand, and on went the dragon after him, and the tide was low, and sleepy little waves lapped the sand's edge. Now, at the lip of the water, Nigel paused and looked back, and the dragon made a bound, beginning a scream of rage that was like all the engines of all the railways in England. But it never uttered the second half of that scream, for now it knew suddenly that it was sleepy. It turned to hurry back to dry land, because sleeping near whirlpools is so unsafe. But before it reached the shore, sleep caught it and turned it to stone. Nigel, seeing this, ran shoreward for his life, and the tide began to flow in, and the time of the whirlpool's sleep was nearly over, and he stumbled, and he waded, and he swam, and the princess pulled for dear life at the cord in her hand, and pulled him up on the dry shelf of rock, just as the great sea dashed in and made itself once more into the girdle of 9 whirlpools all around the island. But the dragon was asleep under the whirlpools, and when he woke up from being asleep, he found he was drowned. So there was an end of him. "Now there's only the griffin," said Nigel, and the princess said, "Yes, only—" And she kissed Nigel and went back to sew the last leaf of the last lily on the bosom of her wedding gown. She thought and thought of what was written on the stone about the griffin being artificial, and next day she said to Nigel, "You know a griffin is half a lion and half an eagle, and the other two halves, when they've joined, make the Leo Griff. But I've never seen him, yet I have an idea. So they talked it over and arranged everything. When the Griffin fell asleep that afternoon at tea time, Nigel went softly behind him and trod on his tail. And at the same time the princess cried, "Look out! There's a lion behind you!" And the Griffin, waking suddenly from his dreams, twisted his large neck around to look for the lion, saw a lion's flank, and fastened its eagle beak in it. For the Griffin had been artificially made by the king enchanter, and the two halves had never really got used to each other. So now the eagle half of the Griffin, who was still rather sleepy, believed that it was fighting a lion, and the lion part, being half asleep, thought it was fighting an eagle, and the whole Griffin in its deep drowsiness hadn't the sense to pull itself together and remember what it was made of. So the Griffin rolled over and over, one end of it fighting with the other, till the eagle end pecked the lion end to death, and the lion end tore the eagle end with its claws till it died, and so the Griffin that was made of a lion and an eagle perished, exactly as if it had been made of Kilkenny cats. "Poor Griffin," said the princess. "It was very good at the housework. I always liked it better than the dragon. It wasn't so hot-tempered." At that moment there was a soft and silky rush behind the princess, and there was her mother, the queen, who had slipped out of the stone statue at the moment the Griffin was dead, and now came hurrying to take her dear daughter in her arms. The witch was clambering slowly off her pedestal. She was a little stiff from standing so long. When they had all explained everything over and over to each other as many times as was good for them, the witch said, "Well, but what about the whirlpools?" And Nigel said he didn't know. Then the witch said, "I'm not a witch any more. I'm only a happy old woman. But I know some things still. Those whirlpools were made by the enchanter king's dropping 9 drops of his blood into the sea. And his blood was so wicked that the sea has been trying ever since to get rid of it, and that made the whirlpools. Now you've only got to go out at low tide." So Nigel understood and went out at low tide, and found in the sandy hollow left by the first whirlpool a great red ruby. That was the first drop of the wicked king's blood. The next day Nigel found another, and next day another, and so on till the 9th day, and then the sea was as smooth as glass. The 9 rubies were used afterwards in agriculture. You had only to throw them out into a field if you wanted it plowed. Then the whole surface of the land turned itself over in its anxiety to get rid of something so wicked, and in the morning the field was found to be plowed as thoroughly as any young man at Oxford. So the wicked king did some good after all. When the sea was smooth, ships came from far and wide, bringing people to hear the wonderful story. And a beautiful palace was built, and the princess was married to Nigel in her gold dress, and they all lived happily as long as was good for them. The dragon still lies, a stone dragon on the sand, and at low tide the children play around him and over him. But the pieces that were left of the Griffin were buried under the herb bed in the palace garden, because it had been so good at housework, and it wasn't its fault that it had been made so badly, and put to such poor work as guarding a lady from her lover. I have no doubt that you will wish to know what the princess lived on during the long years when the dragon did the cooking. My dear, she lived on her income, and that is a thing that a great many people would like to be able to do. End of The Island of the 9 Whirlpools by Edith Nesbit. Recorded by Penny Witt voiceoverwithp.com.
The Pirate Frog and Other Tales by W.A. Frisbie. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Foreword. This book is no arithmetic to vex the mind of youth. Its pages may, perhaps, appear to be devoid of truth. But by these tales the young who learn to recognize a lie, to that extent will know the truth, and profit much thereby. The Pirate Frog. Some boys whose names I do not know went out to sail their boat one day. Fast to the stern they tied a line, so she could not sail far away. But little did those boys suspect that just beyond a floating log, with all his trusty followers, there lay in wait the Pirate Frog. On came the ship, out sprang the frogs, a desperate, determined crew. They climbed aboard with reckless speed, and each one found his work to do. One cut the line, one raised the flag, the captain seized the helm to steer, and thus on peaceful Plunkett's Pond began the Pirate Frog's career. Upon the shore of Plunkett's Pond 3 turtles basked beneath the sun. 'Twas afternoon, the spot was warm, and they were dozing every one. Their eyes were closed, they did not see around the point a sail appear, nor did they know until too late the dreaded Pirate Frog was near. The pirate crew made haste to land. They ran to where the turtles lay, turned all 3 quickly on their backs, then, hoisting sail, sped fast away. For hours the turtles strained and scratched to turn themselves, but all in vain, till Mrs. Muskrat came that way and set them right side up again. As out of Turtle Bay he sailed, the Pirate Frog the waters scanned, and soon he steered his stolen ship to catch some ducklings far from land. Around the downy neck of one a lasso made of cord he cast, and though the victim struggled hard, the cord was strong, the knot held fast. The other ducklings hurried home when this unequal fight began. All breathlessly they told the news to Uncle Peter Pelican. He hurried out across the pond, and first he cut the ducklings' cord, which gave the frightened pirates time to dive to safety overboard. Far up the shores of Plunkett's Pond, within a deep and marshy bay, amid the rustling rushes green, the muskrats' cozy village lay. Now, when the older rats were gone, the little ratlings had no fear. 'Twould have been different had they known the dreaded Pirate Frog was near. But soon the pirate's flag was seen. The town was taken by surprise. One baby rat was caught and bound, and dragged on ship despite his cries. But soon his bonds were gnawed apart, and he for safety scaled the mast. His weight aloft o'erset the ship, and he laughed best, for he laughed last. 'Twas in July, the sun was hot, the pond was smooth, the air was still. The pirate's vessel lay becalmed, without a breeze the sail to fill. But soon a plan had been devised to move the ship without a sail. A diving frog took down a line and tied it round a bullhead's tail. The big fish felt a gentle tug, then saw the line and jumped with fright. He tried in vain to shake it off, and swam away with all his might. This way and that, at race-horse speed, he crossed the pond from side to side, but where he went the ship went too, and all the frogs enjoyed the ride. For weeks the wicked Pirate Frog had filled the water folk with fright. They hid themselves throughout the day, while few dared venture out at night. Had he not grown too rash and bold, they might be living that way still. But his career closed when he tried to stop the busy water-mill. He planned to drive his stolen ship against the wheel and tie it fast, nor did he think, on starting out, that this exploit would be his last. Too late he saw his grave mistake. He tried in vain to reach the shore. The pirate's ship was ground to bits, and Plunkett's Pond knew them no more. Old Daddy Longlegs sat him down and wept in deepest woe. "Alas!" he cried, "the summer's gone, and soon will come the snow. My children beg for warmer clothes, but yet I must refuse, for each one has so many feet, I can't buy overshoes." The Hungry Pupil. To the jungle kindergarten Mrs. Tiger brought her child. He was small and roly-poly. He was also meek and mild, telling him to mind the teacher, not to pull his playmate's hair, and learn his lessons quickly. Then his mother left him there. When she called for him at noontime, he was sitting all alone, with a smile of satisfaction, gnawing at an ostrich bone. All the ground was strewn with feathers, well-picked bones and bits of fur, but the pupils all were missing. Don't you wonder where they were? Her little son came wriggling up, to grave old Mother Eel. "Oh, mother dear," he said with tears, "such awful pains I feel. The doctor says he greatly fears for smallpox I am slated, but yet I have no arms or legs, and can't be vaccinated." The snapping turtle's daughter in dress displayed good taste, but when she tried a belt on, she found she had no waist. The jolly Rough Riders of Wash Day sat jauntily out on the line. Not a man was afraid, for 'twas but dress parade, and their showing was certainly fine. But when from their homes in the tree-tops the enemy sailed through the air, and with coarse muddy feet soiled each garment and sheet, the riders could do naught but stare. A crocodile made up his mind that he'd be clean and neat. On land he walked upon his toes, so's not to soil his feet. But when he came to brush his teeth, he found to his dismay they were so numerous that he was busy all the day. Jane Jenkins liked to look her best, though not too proud a girl. She "did" her hair with strips of tin to make it kink and curl. She twisted it too tight by far, and found to her surprise that, though she tried her very best, she couldn't close her eyes. A Fire in Frogtown. One sultry night in Frogtown, the muskrat's house caught fire. The muskrats, with their babies, rushed out in scant attire. Then all the Frogtown firemen in startled haste arose, and ran to put the fire out with dandelion hose. The Porcupine's Dilemma. A porcupine once played at golf and wore a sweater red. "I notice all the swells dress so, and so will I," he said. But when he found his stylish clothes were far too warm for golf, his sharp quills held that sweater fast, he couldn't get it off. A monkey sitting on a tree above a shady pool looked down and saw a crocodile within the water cool. The crocodile looked up and said, "Come down, my friend, and swim," intending when the monkey came to make a meal of him. The monkey knew this was his plan, but leaped as if to dive. The crocodile spread wide his jaws to catch his meal alive. But he was disappointed much to see his sharp game fail, for as he leaped, the monkey caught and hung there by his tail. One beast there is which should be shunned by little girls and boys. That is the cross rhinoceros, which makes an awful noise. For if they see this animal and do not run away, they imitate its shrill harsh voice and whine the livelong day. Seein' large. A frog who wore new spectacles observed a common fly. "What monster can this be," he said, "that comes before my eye?" But when the fly was quickly caught and on the frog's inside, he felt so empty that he knew his glasses magnified. A turtle has a big bass drum on which he used to play. His comrades didn't like the noise, and so they ran away. He played till he was all tired out. Then all his friends returned and smashed that drum to kindling wood, which they piled up and burned. When Robert Pip put out to sea, his ship was strong and new. He was the captain, proud and bold. He also was the crew. And he could reef and splice and clew, and yaw and luff and steer. For food he carried chocolate drops, his drink was ginger beer. The course as steered by Captain Pip was south-southwest by east, and he had sailed upon his way for 40 days at least, when up there came a tidal wave, and with a rush and roar, picked up his ship and landed it fast on a foreign shore. When Robert Pip's ill-fated ship was landed high and dry, upon a flat and unknown shore, the shades of night were nigh. So down he lay to take his rest upon the vessel's deck, observing that his food and drink were safe despite the wreck. The sun was up when he awoke, and on a hillock near he saw a group of monkey folk who showed no signs of fear. They seemed polite, well-bred and kind. He wished to make them friends, and by the means of chocolate drops he soon had gained his ends. The monkeys met by Captain Pip were all one family, who near the place where he was wrecked dwelt by a banyan tree. They took him to their lofty home, and urged that he should stay, and he consented, for he knew he could not sail away. Within a week he learned their ways, and spoke their language too. He climbed with ease the tallest trees, where dates and cocoas grew. The father monkey and his wife rejoiced in children 3, strong Reginald and Rufus sons, a daughter named Marie. With Rufus and with Reginald, Bob Pip went out one day to find a place for golfing grounds, and teach his friends to play. For clubs they used the bamboo sprouts, in nearby jungles found. For balls they plucked young coconuts, green, hard, and small and round. The monkey boys soon learned the game, and with the greatest ease could drive the ball from hole to hole, o'er brooks and rocks and trees. They swung their clubs with hand or foot, or tail, 'twas all the same, and soon they beat the captain at this ancient royal game. Within the chest of Captain Pip a bag of marbles lay. He fished them out one afternoon, and taught his friends to play. They played the game of Little Ring, upon the hard beach near, until there came a sad mishap, as you shall straightway hear. For as Marie was standing by, there rolled close to her feet a china shooter that indeed looked good enough to eat. She snatched it up to swallow it. It caught. She choked, turned pale. To save her life they hung her up by her prehensile tail. Upon a sunny stretch of sand they lay beside the sea. The father monkey went to stroll, and with him went Marie. She, running on ahead of him, cried out, "For goodness' sake, oh, father dear, come quickly here, and kill this horrid snake." He quickly grasped a driftwood club, and reached his daughter's side. But when he saw that serpent strange, he too was terrified. He shook with fright, but soon he found that what had made him quail was Rufus buried in the sand, all hid except his tail. Now Captain Pip so longed for home, he sought his stranded boat. New rigging here, some patches there, he thought would make her float. His mind was speedily made up, his new idea was tried, and soon his ship, all staunch again, rode proudly on the tide. His monkey friends wept bitterly at losing Captain Pip, till finally Marie ran home to pack her little grip, and when she said, "I'm going too," they all made haste to pack, then boarded ship and sailed away, nor to that isle came back. There was an old school teacher bear, whom a fever had robbed of his hair, and the thought of his loss made him peevish and cross to the cubs who were under his care. So they bought him a bottle or two of a medicine famous and new. Then his hair grew so fast that the old bear at last had to braid it all up in a queue. Small Wee Whip was an Indian, who in a wigwam warm dwelt snugly all the winter through, quite safe from frost and storm. But he had learned of Santa Claus, and so when Christmas came, he hung his deerskin moccasins upon the wigwam frame. And sure enough, the good old saint that night came jingling by, and as he passed, the moccasins caught his observing eye. But wigwams have no chimneys tall, through which old Chris can drop, so Wee Whip's Christmas gifts were left upon the wigwam top. Young Billy Hedgehog wished a nap. He found an easy chair, and snugly curling up in it, he soon forgot all care. Grave old Judge Bruin wished to read, for books were to his taste. In that same chair he sat him down, but rose again in haste. A little girl mermaid sat down by the sea, and mournful, dejected, and tearful was she. She wanted a shirt-waist ironed stiff and nice, but the ocean would take out the starch in a trice. And she wanted blue shoes, for she thought them so sweet. So she sobbed out afresh, for she saw she'd no feet. And she wept and she wailed and she sobbed and she sighed, till her tears added salt to the salty sea's tide. The little girl mermaid dove down in the sea. The crabs and the lobster folk hailed her with glee. The squibs, shrimps, and starfish stood up in a row to welcome her back to her home down below. Behind her seahorses she went for a ride, where brilliant-hued ocean plants swayed in the tide. 'Twas pleasant indeed, and she thought with regret that once she had wished to live out of the wet. The little girl mermaid once bade her friends all to come to a beautiful fancy dress ball. The fiddler crabs fiddled for waltzes and reels, which were gracefully danced by squids, lobsters, and eels. The flounders were awkward, they floundered about, till swordfish policemen escorted them out. But with this exception, the ball had no flaw, and the sawfish declared 'twas the best he e'er saw. The Proud Wishbone. The wishbone was a haughty thing, and high he held his head. The winged twins were but common trash, and drumsticks too, he said. It's just as plain as anything that this is so, quoth he, for there are two of each of them, but only one of me. And when two children at the feast, each for the wishbone cried, the wishbone said, I told you so, and oh, he swelled with pride. They took him each one by a foot, as children often do, then each one gave a sudden tug and broke him right in two. There was a dancing camel with a desert caravan. His driver was a busy and an unaesthetic man, who made the camel work all day and gave him ne'er a chance to lay his heavy load aside and do a fancy dance. But when they reached a city and heard street musicians play, the camel danced a step or two while jogging on his way. And quickly people thronged about to wonder and to stare, while the driver passed the hat and made his fortune then and there. Young George Augustus William Bubb was far too dignified to play at games like other boys. They grated on his pride. He did not know how kites are made, nor how to play at ball, nor how to skate, nor how to swim, nor anything at all. Said Mrs. Robin breathlessly, the frosts are nearly due. This moving south is troublesome, the baggage heavy too. Said Mr. Rob, oh, that's all right, we'll bill the baggage through. The Haughty Cow. Said an acrobatic monkey to the staid and stately cow, come, let us turn some handsprings, I will quickly show you how. But old Bossy shook her head. No, indeed, she sharply said. I have passed the age of nonsense, and I'll not begin it now. The Peanut Bird. Deep in the forest, dark and still, there lives the peanut bird. It rarely walks, it seldom flies, its song is never heard. No fear of hunters armed with salt will make this bird turn pale. It can't be caught with salt, you see, because it has no tail. The Disappointed Bat. A bat played a hand organ out in the street, and carried a sign, I am blind. But though all his music was joyous and sweet, his hearers, he thought, were unkind. For no one who passed dropped a coin in his hat, but each said, why, of course, he's blind as a bat. When Billy Wilson swimming went, it took him half a day to reach the lake because, you see, it was so far away. And so, to stop this loss of time, when next he went to swim, he tied a string around the lake and pulled it home with him. Dicky Pegleg. A sparrow with a wooden leg hopped o'er a roof of tin. and as he hopped, a girl below was overcome with sudden woe to hear that noise begin. "Oh dear," she cried, "here comes the rain, and this is picnic day." Nor did she know what she had heard was just a wooden-legged bird until he flew away. Young Johnny Bingle long had wished to own a truly gun, and so when Christmas came again, his father gave him one. It had a barrel straight and true, a fancy walnut stock, and for his first game Johnny shot the cuckoo in the clock. The Shanghai Twins. As Mother Bantam roamed the field, of worms and bugs in quest, she found 2 large and lonesome eggs in a deserted nest. "This makes my duty clear," said she. "I'll stay and hatch them out." And for 3 weeks that little hen was no more seen about. At length from out those 2 large eggs the young chicks broke their way, and thus the famous Shanghai Twins first saw the light of day. And Mother Bantam stood aghast that new-born pair to see, for, standing in his stocking feet, each was as tall as she. When Mother Bantam came to feed the hungry Shanghai Twins, she found she had an awful task to fill them to their chins, and if they were not filled that full, they clamored to be fed, until in running down their food, she worked till nearly dead. With hoppers and with ladybugs, with moths and worms and flies, with grains of corn and crumbs of bread, she stopped their hungry cries. Till finally she ran so much to get them food to eat, that she herself, worn out and starved, was overcome by heat. Said Mother Bantam to her twins, "Since you 2 have been hatched, you have not found a single meal, you have not run nor scratched. I've fed you as a mother should, but you are stronger now, and henceforth you must scratch for worms." Cried they, "Please show us how." She led them to the garden plot. "Dig in your claws," said she. "Just catch the dirt and push it back. It's easy, don't you see?" "Ah, yes," they cried, and went to work, with all their main and might. And ere they knew what they had done, they buried her from sight. The Shanghai Twins came on apace, so rapidly they grew, that larger, stronger fowls than they became extremely few, and Mother Bantam gazed with pride her foster sons upon. The one of them was christened James, the other one was John. Beneath the battered henhouse door, a hungry fox one night poked in his nose, and all the fowls were paralyzed with fright. But James and John knew what to do. They fought with might and main, until the fox took to his heels with yelps of fear and pain. Now when the valiant Shanghai Twins had put a fox to flight, they stood on guard to watch the house, the balance of the night. And while they watched, the other fowls reposed in perfect peace. So after that the twins were named as Poultry Yard Police. Each wore, to show his lofty rank, a helmet, club, and star, and soon as faithful guardians their fame spread near and far. The very mention of their names made thieving fowls turn pale, for well they knew that John and James could march them off to jail. 3 young and interesting pigs once lived within a sty, and one was greedy, one was strong, and one was scarce a half-yard long, and scant 10 inches high. The greedy one, when large and fat, was led away one day. The strong one rooted at his pen, until he made a hole, and then crept out and ran away. The smallest pig, with careful thought, made up his mind to stay. He did not eat enough to grow, he did not run away, and so he lives in peace today. Once on a time. If you had lived, once on a time, just as the storybooks all say, oh, wouldn't it have been a sight to see the knights with dragons fight and bear their heads away? And it was once upon a time that little boys came to be kings, that fairies flitted here and there to little girls with presents rare, rich gowns and diamond rings. But now, dear me, how things are changed, and yet, perhaps, 'tis just as well, for if 'twere not so long ago, that all these wondrous things were so, there'd be no tales to tell. To Mr. Fox's barber shop, the large important Mr. Bear once took his chubby little son to have the barber trim his hair. The cloth was tucked about his neck, when in the mirror large and tall he chanced to see another bear, and cuffed the glass to pieces small. Perhaps there is a funny land, where rabbits dress in long-tailed coats, and kittens all wear wooden shoes, and schools are taught by learned goats, where crocodiles play violins, and owls are decked in gowns and caps. But if there is a land like this, you cannot find it on the maps. A very foolish little clam at night sat up till very late. His parents said repeatedly that he should not thus dissipate. But he would never heed their words. He was too headstrong to obey, and thus he had so little sleep that he was sleepy all the day. One summer morning on the beach he opened wide his shell to yawn. A big red bird came walking by. A snap, a gulp, the clam was gone. So, children, though you are too large for any hungry bird to hold, you see 'tis much the wiser plan to go to bed when you are told. The Airships. The airship fleet of Meadowville floats gaily o'er the town. For older people fully grown, the craft is thistledown. The smaller of the meadow folk on fluffy silkweed ride, and there's a ship for everyone, with ships to spare beside. End of The Pirate Frog and Other Tales by W.A. Frisbie. Recording by Lee Smalley.
The Rainbow Maker by Mrs. W.K. Clifford. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. The Rainbow Maker. The children stood under an archway. Behind them was the blue sky. In front of them the clear, still lake that wandered and wound about the garden. Above their heads, the leaves of a tree whispered and told strange stories to the breeze. "Poor tree! It is sighing for the blossoms the wind has carried away," they said to each other, and they looked back at the garden. "And poor flowers, too," they said. "All your bright colors are gone. Your petals lie scattered on the ground. Tomorrow they will be dead." "Ah, no," the flowers sighed. "The Rainbow Maker will gather them up, and once more they will see the sun." Before the children could answer, a tall, fair maiden came down the pathway. They could see her plainly in the twilight. Her eyes were dim with gathering tears, but on her lips there was a smile that came and went and flickered round her mouth. All down her back hung her pale golden hair. Round her neck was a kerchief of many colors. Her dress was soft and white, and her snowy apron was gathered up in one hand. She looked neither to the right nor to the left. She did not utter a single word, and the children could hear no sound of her footstep, no rustling from her dress. She stooped, and picking up the fading petals, looked at them tenderly for a moment, while the tears fell slowly down her cheeks. But the smile hovered round her mouth, for she knew that they would shine again in the sight of their beloved sun. When her apron was quite full, she turned round and left the garden. Hand in hand the children followed. She went slowly on by the side of the lake, far, far away across the meadows and up the farthest hill, until at last she found her home behind a cloud just opposite the sun. There she sat all through the summer days, making rainbows. When the children had watched her for a long time, they went softly back to their own home. The Rainbow Maker had not even seen them. "Mother," they said one day, We now know where the colors go from the flowers. See, they are there." And as they spoke, they thought of the maiden sitting silently at work in her cloud home. They knew she was weeping at sending forth her most beautiful one, and yet smiling as she watched the soft archway she had made. "See, they are all there, dear mother," the children repeated, looking at the falling rain and the shining sun, and pointing to the rainbow that spanned the river. End of The Rainbow Maker by Mrs. W.K. Clifford, read by Chancebarrington.
The Tale of Mrs. Tittlemouse by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Once upon a time, there was a wood mouse, and her name was Mrs. Tittlemouse. She lived in a bank under a hedge. Such a funny house! There were yards and yards of sandy passages, leading to storerooms and nut cellars and seed cellars, all amongst the roots of the hedge. There was a kitchen, a parlor, a pantry, and a larder. Also, there was Mrs. Tittlemouse's bedroom, where she slept in a little box bed. Mrs. Tittlemouse was a most terribly tidy, particular little mouse, always sweeping and dusting the soft sandy floors. Sometimes a beetle lost its way in the passages. "Shoo! Shoo! Little dirty feet!" said Mrs. Tittlemouse, clattering her dustpan. And one day an old woman ran up and down in a spotty red cloak. "Your house is on fire, Mother Ladybird. Fly away home to your children." Another day, a big fat spider came in to shelter from the rain. "Beg pardon, is this not Miss Muffet's?" "Go away, you bold, bad spider, leaving ends of cobwebs all over my nice, clean house." She bundled the spider out at a window. He let himself down the hedge with a long, thin bit of string. Mrs. Tittlemouse went on her way to a distant storeroom to fetch cherry stones and thistledown seed for dinner. All along the passage she sniffed and looked at the floor. "I smell a smell of honey. Is it the cowslip outside in the hedge? I am sure I can see the marks of little dirty feet." Suddenly, round a corner, she met Babbity Bumble. "Bizz, bizz, bizz," said the bumblebee. Mrs. Tittlemouse looked at her severely. She wished that she had a broom. "Good day, Babbity Bumble. I should be glad to buy some beeswax, but what are you doing down here? Why do you always come in at a window and say ziz, biz, biz?" Mrs. Tittlemouse began to get cross. "Ziz, biz, whiz," replied Babbity Bumble in a peevish squeak. She sidled down a passage and disappeared into a storeroom which had been used for acorns. Mrs. Tittlemouse had eaten the acorns before Christmas. The storeroom ought to have been empty. But it was full of untidy, dry moss. Mrs. Tittlemouse began to pull out the moss. 3 or 4 other bees put their heads out and buzzed fiercely. "I am not in the habit of letting lodgings. This is an intrusion," said Mrs. Tittlemouse. "I will have them turned out." Buzz, buzz, buzz. "I wonder who will help me." Bizz, whiz, whiz. "I will not have Mr. Jackson. He never wipes his feet." Mrs. Tittlemouse decided to leave the bees till after dinner. When she got back to the parlor, she heard someone coughing in a fat voice, and there sat Mr. Jackson himself. He was sitting all over a small rocking chair, twiddling his thumbs and smiling with his feet on the fender. He lived in a drain below the hedge, in a very dirty, wet ditch. "How do you do, Mr. Jackson? Dearie me, you have got very wet." "Thank you, Mrs. Tittlemouse. I'll sit a while and dry myself," said Mr. Jackson. He sat and smiled, and the water dripped off his coat tails. Mrs. Tittlemouse went round with a mop. He sat such a while that he had to be asked if he would take some dinner. First she offered him cherry stones. "Thank you, Mrs. Tittlemouse. No teeth, no teeth, no teeth," said Mr. Jackson. He opened his mouth most unnecessarily wide. He certainly had not a tooth in his head. Then she offered him thistledown seed. "Tiddly widdly widdly poof, poof, poof," said Mr. Jackson. He blew the thistledown all over the room. "Thank you, Mrs. Tittlemouse. Now, what I really, really should like would be a little dish of honey." "I am afraid I have not got any, Mr. Jackson," said Mrs. Tittlemouse. "Tiddly widdly widdly, Mrs. Tittlemouse," said the smiling Mr. Jackson. "I can smell it. That is why I came to call." Mr. Jackson rose ponderously from the table and began to look into the cupboards. Mrs. Tittlemouse followed him with a dishcloth to wipe his large, wet footmarks off the parlor floor. When he had convinced himself that there was no honey in the cupboards, he began to walk down the passage. "Indeed, you will stick fast, Mr. Jackson." "Tiddly widdly widdly, Mrs. Tittlemouse." First he squeezed into the pantry. "Tiddly widdly widdly, no honey? No honey, Mrs. Tittlemouse?" There were 3 creepy-crawly people hiding in the plate rack. 2 of them got away, but the littlest one he caught. Then he squeezed into the larder. Mrs. Butterfly was tasting the sugar, but she flew away out the window. "Tiddly widdly widdly, Mrs. Tittlemouse. You seem to have plenty of visitors." "And without any invitation," said Mrs. Thomasina Tittlemouse. They went along the sandy passage. "Tiddly widdly, buzz, whiz, whiz." He met BettyB round a corner and snapped her up, and put her down again. "I do not like bumblebees. They are all over bristles," said Mr. Jackson, wiping his mouth with his coat sleeve. "Get out, you nasty old toad!" shrieked BettyB. "I shall go distracted," scolded Mrs. Tittlemouse. She shut herself up in the nut cellar, while Mr. Jackson pulled out the bee's nest. He seemed to have no objection to stings. When Mrs. Tittlemouse ventured to come out, everybody had gone away. But the untidiness was something dreadful. Never did I see such a mess! Smears of honey, and moss, and thistledown, and marks of big and little dirty feet, all over my nice clean house. She gathered up the moss and the remains of the beeswax. Then she went out and fetched some twigs to partly close up the front door. "I will make it too small for Mr. Jackson." She fetched soft soap and flannel and a new scrubbing brush from the storeroom, but she was too tired to do any more. First she fell asleep in her chair, and then she went to bed. "Will it ever be tidy again," said poor Mrs. Tittlemouse. Next morning she got up very early and began a spring cleaning which lasted a fortnight. She swept and scrubbed and dusted, and she rubbed up the furniture with the beeswax and polished her little tin spoons. When it was all beautifully neat and clean, she gave a party to 5 other little mice, without Mr. Jackson. He smelt the party and came up the bank, but he could not squeeze in at the door. So they handed him out acorn cupfuls of honeydew through the window, and he was not at all offended. He sat outside in the sun and said, "Diddly widdly widdly, your very good health, Mrs. Tittlemouse." The End. End of the Tale of Mrs. Tittlemouse by Beatrix Potter. Read by Alina, Nuno.
The Candy Country by Louisa May Alcott. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Annie Mars. I shall take Mamma's red sun umbrella. It is so warm, and none of the children at school will have one like it, said Lily one day as she went through the hall. The wind is very high. I'm afraid you'll be blown away if you carry that big thing, called Nurse from the window as the red umbrella went bobbing down the garden walk with a small girl under it. I wish it would. I always wanted to go up in a balloon, answered Lily as she struggled out of the gate. She got on very well till she came to the bridge and stopped to look over the railing at the water running by so fast, and the turtles sunning themselves on the rocks. Lily was fond of throwing stones at them. It was so funny to watch them tumble heels over head, splash into the water. Now, when she saw the 3 big fellows close by, she stooped for a stone, and just at that minute a gust of wind nearly took the umbrella right out of her hand. She clenched it fast, and away she went like a thistle down, right up in the air, over river and hill, houses and trees, faster and faster, till her head spun round, her breath was all gone, and she had to let go. The dear red umbrella flew away like a leaf, and Lily fell down till she went crash into a tree, which grew in such a curious place that she forgot her fright as she sat looking about her, wondering what part of the world it could be. The tree looked as if it was made of glass or coloured sugar, for she could see through the red cherries, the green leaves, and the brown branches. An agreeable smell met her nose, and she said at once, as any child would, "I smell candy!" She picked a cherry and ate it. Oh, how good it was! All sugar and no stone. The next discovery was such a delightful one that she nearly fell off her perch, for by touching her tongue here and there, she found that the whole tree was made of candy. Think what fun to sit and break off twigs of barley sugar, candied cherries and leaves that tasted like peppermint and sassafras. Lily rocked and ate till she finished the top of the little tree. Then she climbed down and strolled along, making more surprising and agreeable discoveries as she went. What looked like snow under her feet was white sugar. The rocks were lumps of chocolate. The flowers of all colours and tastes and every sort of fruit grew on these delightful trees. Little white houses soon appeared, and here lived the dainty candy people, all made up of the best sugar and painted to look like real people. Dear little men and women, looking as if they had stepped off of wedding cakes and bonbons, went about in their gay sugar clothes, laughing and talking in the sweetest voices. Bits of the babies rocked in open-work cradles,
and sugar boys and girls played with sugar toys in the most natural way. Carriages rolled along the jujube streets, drawn by the red and yellow barley horses we all love so well. Cows fed in the green fields, and sugar birds sang in the trees. Lily listened, and in a moment she understood what the song said. "Sweet, sweet, come, come and eat, dear little girls with yellow curls. Here you'll find sweets to your mind. On every tree sugar plums you'll see. In every dell grows the caramel. Over every wall gumdrops fall. Molasses flows where our river goes. Under your feet lies sugar sweet. Over your head grows almonds red. Our lily and rose are not for the nose. Our flowers we pluck to eat or suck. And oh, what bliss when two friends kiss! For they honey sip from lip to lip. And all you meet in house or street, at work or play, sweethearts they are. So little dear, pray feel no fear. Go where you will, eat your fill. Here is a feast from east to west. And you can say, ere you go away, at last I stand in dear Candy Land, and no more can stuff, for once I've enough. Sweet, sweet, tweet, tweet, twiddle-dee, twiddle-dee." "That is the most interesting song I have ever heard," said Lily, clapping her sticky hands and dancing along toward a fine palace of white cream candy, with pillars of striped peppermint stick and a roof of frosting that made it look like the Milan Cathedral. "I'll live here and eat candy all day long, with no tiresome school or patchwork to spoil my fun," said Lily. So she ran up the chocolate steps into the pretty rooms, where all the chairs and tables were made of different coloured candies, and the beds of spun sugar. A fountain of lemonade supplied drink, and floors of ice cream that never melted kept people and things from sticking together, as they would have done had it been warm. For a long while Lily was quite happy, going about, tasting so many different kinds of sweeties, talking to the little people who were very amiable, and finding out curious things about them and their country. The babies were made of plain sugar, but the grown-up people had different flavors. The young ladies were flavored with violet, rose, and orange. The gentlemen were apt to have cordials of some sort inside them, as she found when she ate one now and then slyly, and got her tongue bitten by the hot, strong taste as a punishment. The old people tasted of peppermint, clove, and such comfortable things good for pain, but the old maids had lemon, horehound, flagroot, and all sorts of sour, bitter things in them, and did not get eaten much. Lily soon learned to know the characters of her new friends by a single taste, and some she never touched but once. Their dear babies melted in her mouth, and the delicately flavoured young lady she was very fond of. Dr. Ginger was called to her more than once when so much candy made her teeth ache, and she found him a very hot-tempered little man, but he stopped the pain, so she was glad to see him. A lime-drop boy and a little pink checkerberry girl were her favourite playmates, and they had fine times making mud pies by scraping the chocolate rocks and mixing this dust with honey from the wells nearby. These they could eat, and Lily thought this much better than throwing away the pies as she had to do at home. They had candy pools every so often, and made swings of long loops of molasses candy, and birds' nests with almond eggs, out of which came birds who sang so sweetly. They played football with big bull's eyes, sailed in sugar boats on lakes of syrup, fished in rivers of molasses, and rode the barley horses all over the country. Lily discovered that it never rained, but snowed white sugar. There was no sun, as it would have been too hot, but a large yellow lozenge made a nice moon, and red and white comfy were the stars. The people all lived on sugar and never quarrelled. No one was ill,
and if any got broken, as sometimes happened with such brittle creatures, they just stuck the parts together and were all right again. The way they grew old was to get thinner and thinner till there was a danger of their vanishing. Then the friends of the old person would put him in a neat coffin and carried him to the great golden urn which stood in their largest temple, always full of a certain fine syrup, and here he was dipped and dipped till he was stout and strong again, and went home to enjoy himself for a long time as good as new. This was very interesting to Lily, and she went to many funerals, but the weddings were better still, for the lovely white brides were so sweet Lily longed to eat them. The feasts were so delicious, and everybody went in their best clothes, and danced at the ball till they got so warm, half a dozen would stick together and have to be taken to the ice cream room to cool off. Then the little pair would drive away in a fine carriage with white horses to a new palace in some other part of the country, and Lily would have another pleasant place to visit. But by and by, when she had seen everything and eaten so much sweet stuff that at last she longed for plain bread and butter, she began to get cross, as children always do when they live on candy. And the little people wished she would go away, for they were afraid of her. No wonder, when she would catch up a dear sugar baby and eat him, or break some respectable old grandmamma all into bits because she reproved her for how naughty she was. Lily calmly sat down on the biggest church, crushing it flat, and even tried to poke the moon out of the sky in a pet one day. The king ordered her to go home, but she said, "I won't," and bit his head off, crown and all. Such a wail went up at this awful deed that she ran away out of the city, fearing someone would put poison in her candy, since she had no other food. "I suppose I shall get somewhere if I can keep walking, and I can't starve, though I hate the sight of this horrid stuff," she said to herself as she hurried over the mountains of Gibraltar rock that divided the city of Saccharissa from the great desert of brown sugar that lay beyond. Lily marched bravely on for a long time, and saw at last a great smoke in the sky, smelt a spicy smell, and felt a hot wind blowing toward her. "I wonder if there are sugar savages here, roasting and eating some poor traveller like me," she said, thinking of Robinson Crusoe and the other wanderers in strange lands. She crept carefully along till she saw a settlement of little huts, very like mushrooms, for they were made of cookies set on lumps of brown sugar, and queer people, looking as if made of gingerbread, were working very busily round several stoves which seemed to bake at a great rate. "I'll creep nearer and see what sort of people they are before I show myself," said Lily, going into a grove of spice trees and sitting down on a stone, which proved to be the plummy sort of cake we used to call Brighton Rock. Presently, one of the tallest men came striding towards the tree with a pan, evidently after spice, and before she could run, he saw Lily. "Hullo, what do you want?" he asked, staring at her with his black currant eyes, while he briskly picked the bark off a cinnamon tree. "I'm travelling, and would like to know what place this is, if you please," answered Lily very politely, and being a little frightened. "Cakeland, where do you come from?" asked the gingerbread man in a crisp tone of voice. "I was blown into the candy country and have been there a long time, but I got tired of it and ran away to find something better." "Sensible child," and the man smiled till Lily thought his cheeks would crumble. "You'll get better here with us brownies than with the lazy bonbons, who never work and are all for show. They won't own us, though we are all related through our grandparents' sugar and molasses. We are busy folks, so they turn up their noses and don't speak when we meet at parties. Poor creatures, silly and sweet and unsubstantial. I pity them." "Could I make you a visit? I'd like to see how you live and what you do. I'm sure it must be interesting," said Lily, picking herself up after a tumble, having eaten nearly all the stone. She was so hungry. "I know you will. Come on, I can talk while I work." And the funny gingerbread man trotted off toward his kitchen, full of pans, rolling pins, and molasses jugs. "Sit down. I shall be at leisure as soon as this batch is baked. There are still some wise people down below who like gingerbread, and I have my hands full," he said, dashing about, stirring, rolling out, and slapping the brown dough into pans, which he whisked into the oven and out again so fast that Lily knew there must be magic about it somewhere. Every now and then he threw her a delicious cookie, warm from the oven. She liked the queer fellow, and presently began to talk, being very curious about this country. "What is your name, sir?" "Gingersnap." Lily thought it was a good one, for he was very quick, and she fancied he could be short and sharp if he liked. "Where does all this cake go?" she asked, after watching the other kitchens full of workers, who were all of different kinds of cake, and each set of cooks made its own sort. "I'll show you by and by," answered Snap, beginning to pile up the heaps of gingerbread on a little car that ran along a track leading to some unknown storeroom, Lily thought. "Don't you get tired of doing this all the time?" "Yes, but I want to be promoted, and I never shall be till I've done my best and won the prize here." "Oh, tell me about it. What is the prize, and how are you promoted? Is this a cooking school?" "Yes, the prize for the best gingerbread is a cake of condensed yeast that puts a soul into me, and I begin to rise till I am able to go over the hills yonder into the blessed land of bread and be one of the happiest creatures who are always wholesome, always needed, and without which the world would be in a bad way." "Bless me, that is the queerest thing I've heard yet. But I don't wonder you want to go. I'm tired of sweets myself, and long for a good piece of bread, though I used to want cake and candy at home." "Ah, my dear, you'll learn a good deal here, and you were lucky not to have got into the clutches of giant dyspepsia, who always gets people if they eat too much of such rubbish and scorn wholesome bread. I leave my ginger behind when I go, and I get white and round and beautiful, as you will see. The gingerbread family have never been as foolish as some of the other cakes. Wedding is the worst. Such extravagance in the way of wine and spice and fruit I never saw, and such a mess to eat when it's done. I don't wonder people get sick. Serves 'em right." And Snap flung down a pan with such a bang that it made Lily jump. "Sponge cake isn't bad, is it? Mamma lets me eat it, but I like frosted pound better," she said, looking over to the next kitchen where piles of that sort of cake were being iced. "Poor stuff, no substance. Ladies' fingers will do for babies, but pound has too much butter ever to be healthy. Let it alone and eat cookies or seed cakes, my dear. Now come along, I'm ready," and Snap trundled away his carload at a great pace. Lily ran behind to pick up whatever fell, and looked about her as she went, for this was certainly a queer little country. Lakes of eggs all beaten up, and hot springs of celeratus foamed here and there, ready for use. The earth was brown sugar or ground spice, and the only fruits were raisins, dried currants, and citron and lemon peel. It was a very busy place, for everyone cooked all the time, and never failed, and never seemed tired. though they got so hot, and they only wore sheets of paper for clothes. There were piles of it to put over the cake so that it shouldn't burn, and they made cooks' white caps and aprons of it, and looked very nice. A large clock made of a flat pancake with cloves to mark the hours, and 2 toothpicks for hands showed them how long to bake things, and in one place an ice wall was built around a cake of butter, which they cut in lumps as they wanted it. "Here we are. Now stand away while I pitch them down," said Snap, stopping at last before a hole in the ground where a dumbwaiter hung ready with a name over it. There were many holes all around, and many waiters, each with its name, and Lily was amazed when she read Weber, Copeland, Dooling, and others which she knew very well. Over Snap's place was the name Newmarch, and Lily said, "Why, that's where Mama gets her hard gingerbread, and Weber's is where we go for ice cream. Do you make cake for them?" "Yes, but no one knows it. It's one of the secrets of the trade. We cook for all the confectioners, and people think the good things come from the cellars under their saloons. Good joke, isn't it?" And Snap laughed till a crack came in his neck and made him cough. Lily was so surprised she sat down on a warm queen's cake that happened to be near, and watched Snap send down load after load of gingerbread, to be eaten by children who would have liked it much better if they had only known where it had come from, as she did. As she sat, the clatter of many spoons, the smell of many dinners, and the sound of many voices calling 1 vanilla, 2 strawberries and a Charlotte Russe, 3 stews, cup coffee, dry roast chicken, and apple without, came up the next hole, which was marked Copeland. "Dear me, it seems as if I was there," said Lily, longing to hop down, but afraid of the bump at the other end. "I'm done. Come along, I'll ride you back," called Snap, tossing the last cookie after the dumbwaiter as it went slowly out of sight with its spicy load. "I wish you'd teach me to cook. It sounds great fun, and Mama wants me to learn, only our cook hates to have me mess round, and is so cross that I don't like to try at home," said Lily as she went trundling back. "Better wait till you get to Breadland and learn to make that. It's a great art and worth knowing. Don't waste your time on cake. Though plain gingerbread isn't bad to have in the house, I'll teach you that in a jiffy, if the clock doesn't strike my hour soon," answered Snap, helping her down. "What hour?" "Why, of my freedom. I never know when I've done my task till I'm called by the chime and go to get my soul," said Snap, turning his currant eyes anxiously to the clock. "I hope you will have time," and Lily fell to work with all her might after Snap had put on her paper apron and cap like his. It was not hard, for when she was going to make a mistake, a spark flew out of the fire and burned her in time to remind her to look at the receipt, which was a sheet of gingerbread in a frame of pie crust hung up before her, with the directions written, while it was soft and baked in. The third sheet she made came out of the oven, spicy, light, and brown, and Snap, giving it one poke, said, "That's all right. Now you know. Here's your reward." He handed her a receipt book made of thin sheets of sugar gingerbread held together by a gelatin binding, with her name stamped on the back, and each leaf crimped with a cake cutter in the most elegant manner. Lily was charmed with it, but had no time to read all it contained, for just then the clock began to strike and the chime of the bells to ring. "Gingerbread, go to the head, your task is done, a soul is won. Take it and go where muffins grow, where sweet loaves rise to the very skies, and biscuits fair perfume the air. Away, away, make no delay, in a sea of flour plunge this hour. Safe in your breast, let the yeast cake rest, till you rise in joy, a white bread boy. Ha ha! I'm free! I'm free! cried Snap, catching up the silver-covered square that seemed to fall from heaven, and running to a great white sea of flour, he went in head first, holding the yeast cake clasped to his breast as if his life depended on it. Lily watched breathlessly while a curious working and bubbling went on, as if Snap was tumbling about down there like a small earthquake. The other cake folks stood round the shore with her, for it was a great event, and all were glad that their dear fellow was promoted so soon. Suddenly a cry was heard, and up rose a beautiful white figure on the farther side of the sea. It moved its hand as if saying goodbye, and ran over the hills so fast they had only time to see how plump and fair he was, with a little knob on the top of his head like a crown. He's gone to the happy land, and we shall miss him, but we'll follow his example and soon find him again, said a gentle sponge cake with a sigh, as all went back to their work, while Lily hurried after Snap, eager to see the new country, which was best of all. A delicious odour of bread blew up from the valley as she stood on the hilltop and looked down on the peaceful scene below. Fields of yellow grain waved in the breeze, hop vines grew from tree to tree, and many windmills whirled their white sails as they ground the different grains into fresh sweet meal for the loaves of bread that built the houses like bricks and paved the streets, or in many shapes formed the people, furniture, and animals. A river of milk flowed through the peaceful land, and fountains of yeast rose and fell with a pleasant foam and fizz. The ground was a mixture of many meals, and the paths were a golden Indian, which gave a very gay look to the scene. Buckwheat flowers bloomed on their rosy stems, and tall cornstalks rustled their leaves in the warm air that came from the ovens hidden in the hillsides. For bread needs a slow fire, and an obliging volcano did the baking here. "What a lovely place!" cried Lily, feeling the charm of the home-like landscape in spite of the plump people moving about. Two of these figures came running to meet her as she slowly walked down the yellow path from the hill. One was a golden boy with a beaming face, the other a little girl in a shiny brown cloak, who looked as if she would taste very nice. They each put a warm hand into Lily's, and the boy said, "We're glad to see you. Muffin told us you were coming." "Thank you. Who is Muffin?" asked Lily, feeling as if she had seen both these little people before and liked them. "He was Gingersnap once, but he's a Muffin now. We begin in that way and work up to the perfect loaf by degrees. My name is Johnny Cake, and she's Sally Lunn. You know us, so come on and have a race." Lily burst out laughing at the idea of playing with these old friends of hers, and all three ran away as fast as they could to tear down the hill, over a bridge and into the middle of the village, where they stopped panting and sat down on some very soft rolls to rest. "What do you all do here?" asked Lily when she got her breath again. "We farm, we study, we bake, we brew, and are as merry as grigs all day long. It's school time now, and we must go. Will you come?" said Sally, jumping up as if she liked it. "Our schools are not like yours. We only study two things, grain and yeast. I think you'll like it. We have yeast today, and the experiments are very jolly," added Johnny, trotting off to a tall brown tower of rye and Indian bread where the school was kept. Lily never liked to go to school, but she was ashamed to own it, so she went along with Sally and was so amused with all she saw that she was glad she came. The brown loaf was hollow and had no roof, and when she asked why they used the ruin, Sally told her to wait and see why they chose the strong walls and plenty of room overhead. All around was a circle of very small biscuits, like cushions, and on these the bread children sat. A square loaf In the middle was the teacher's desk, and on it lay an ear of wheat with several bottles of yeast well corked up. The teacher was a pleasant, plump lady from Vienna, very wise, and so famous for her good bread that she was a professor of grainology. When all was seated, she began with the wheat ear and told them all about it in such an interesting way that Lily felt as if she had never known anything about the bread she ate before. The experiments with the yeast were quite exciting, for Fraulein Pretzel showed them how it would work till it blew the cork out and go fizzing up to the sky if it was kept too long, how it would turn sour or flat and spoil the bread if care was not taken to use it just at the right moment, and how too much would cause the loaf to rise till there was no substance to it. The children were very bright, for they were fed on the best kinds of oatmeal and graham bread, with very little white bread or hot cakes to spoil their young stomachs. Hearty, happy boys and girls they were, and their yeasty souls were very lively in them, for they danced and sang and seemed as bright and gay as if acidity, heaviness, and mould were quite unknown. Lily was very happy with them, and when school was done, she went home with Sally and ate the best bread and milk for dinner that she ever tasted. In the afternoon, Johnny took her to the cornfield and showed her how they kept the growing ears free from mildew and worms. Then she went to the bakehouse, and here she found her old friend Muffin hard at work making Parker house rolls. For he was such a good cook, he was set to work at once on the lighter kinds of bread. "Well, isn't this better than Candyland or Saccharissa?" he asked, as he rolled and folded his bits of dough with a dab of butter tucked inside. "Ever so much," cried Lily. "I feel better already and mean to learn all I can. Mamma will be so pleased if I can make good bread when I go home. She is rather old-fashioned and likes me to be a nice housekeeper. I didn't think bread interesting then, but I do now, and Johnny's mother is going to teach me to make Indian cakes tomorrow."
"Glad to hear it. Learn all you can and tell other people how to make healthy bodies and happy souls by eating good plain food. Not like this, though. These rolls are better than cake. I have to work my way up to the perfect loaf, you know, and then I'm a happy thing."
"What happens then? Do you go on to some other wonderful place?" asked Lily as Muffin paused with a smile on his face.
"Yes, I am eaten by some wise, good human being and become a part of him or her. That is immortality and heaven, for I may nourish a poet and help him sing, or feed a good woman who makes the world better for being in it, or be crumbled into the golden porringer of a baby prince who is to rule a kingdom. Isn't that a noble way to live and an end worth working for?"
asked Muffin in a tone that made Lily feel as if some sort of fine yeast had gotten into her and was setting her brain to work with new thoughts. "Yes, it is. I suppose all common things are made for that purpose, if we only knew it, and people should be glad to do anything to help the world along, even making good bread in a kitchen," answered Lily in a sober way that showed that her little mind was already digesting the new food it had got. She stayed in Breadland a long time and enjoyed and learned a great deal that she never forgot. But at last, when she had made the perfect loaf, she wanted to go home, that her mother might see and taste it. "I've put a good deal of myself into it, and I'd love to think that I had given her strength or pleasure by my work," she said, as she and Sally stood looking at the handsome loaf. "You can go wherever you like. Just take the bread in your hands and wish 3 times, and you'll be wherever you say. I'm sorry you have to go, but I don't wonder you want to see your mother. Don't forget what you have learned, and you will always be glad to come to us," said Sally, kissing her goodbye.
Where is Muffin? I can't go without seeing him, my dear old friend," answered Lily, looking around for him. "He is here," said Sally, touching the loaf. "He was ready to go, and chose to pass into your bread rather than any other, for he said he loved you and would be glad to help feed so good a little girl." "How kind of him! I must be careful to grow wise and excellent, else he will be disappointed and have died in vain," said Lily, touched by his devotion. Then, bidding them all farewell, she hugged her loaf close, wished 3 times to be in her own home, and like a flash she was there. Whether her friends believed the wonderful tale of her adventures I cannot tell, but I know that she was a nice little housekeeper from that day, and made such good bread that other girls came to learn of her. She also grew from a sickly, fretful child into a fine, strong woman, because she ate very little cake and candy except at Christmas time, when the oldest and the wisest loved to make a short visit to Candyland. End of The Candy Country by Louisa May Alcott. Read for you by Annie Mars.
The Tale of Benjamin Bunny by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Chad Horner. One morning a little rabbit sat on a bank. He pricked his ears and listened to the trit-trot of a pony. A gig was coming along the road. It was driven by Mr. McGregor, and beside him sat Mrs. McGregor in her best bonnet. As soon as they had passed, little Benjamin Bunny slid down into the road and set off, with a hop, skip, and a jump, to call upon his relations who lived in the wood at the back of Mr. McGregor's garden. That wood was full of rabbit holes, and in the neatest, sandiest hole of all lived Benjamin's aunt and his cousins, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter. Old Mrs. Rabbit was a widow. She earned her living by knitting rabbit wool mittens and muffetees. I once bought a pair at a bazaar. She also sold herbs and rosemary tea and rabbit tobacco, which is what we call lavender. Little Benjamin did not very much want to see his aunt. He came round the back of the fir tree and nearly tumbled upon the top of his cousin Peter. Peter was sitting by himself. He looked pearly, and was dressed in a red cotton pocket handkerchief. "Peter," said little Benjamin in a whisper, "who has got your clothes?" Peter replied, "The scarecrow in Mr. McGregor's garden," and described how he had been chased about the garden and had dropped his shoes and coat. Little Benjamin sat down beside his cousin and assured him that Mr. McGregor had gone out in a gig, and Mrs. McGregor also, and certainly for the day, because she was wearing her best bonnet. Peter said he hoped it would rain. At this point old Mrs. Rabbit's voice was heard inside the rabbit hole, calling, "Cottontail, Cottontail, fetch some more camomile." Peter said he thought he might feel better if he went for a walk. They went away hand in hand and got upon the flat top of the wall at the bottom of the wood. From here they looked down into Mr. McGregor's garden. Peter's coat and shoes were plainly to be seen upon the scarecrow, topped with an old tam o' shanter of Mr. McGregor's. Little Benjamin said it spoils people's clothes to squeeze under a gate. The proper way to get in is to climb down a pear tree. Peter fell down head first, but it was of no consequence, as the bed below was newly raked and quite soft. It had been sown with less. They left a great many odd little footmarks all over the bed, especially little Benjamin, who was wearing clogs. Little Benjamin said that the first thing to be done was to get back Peter's clothes, in order that they might be able to use the pocket handkerchief. They took them off the scarecrow. There had been rain during the night, there was water in the shoes, and the coat was somewhat shrunk. Benjamin tried on the tam o' shanter, but it was too big for him. Then he suggested that they should fill the pocket handkerchief with onions as a little present for his aunt. Peter did not seem to be enjoying himself. He kept hearing noises. Benjamin, on the contrary, was perfectly at home, and ate a lettuce leaf. He said that he was in the habit of coming to the garden with his father to get lettuce for their Sunday dinner. The name of little Benjamin's papa was old Mr. Benjamin Bunny. The lettuces certainly were very fine. Peter did not eat anything. He said he should like to go home. Presently he dropped half the onions. Little Benjamin said that it was not possible to get back up the pear tree with a load of vegetables. He led the way boldly towards the other end of the garden. They went along a little walk on planks under a sunny red brick wall. The mice sat on the doorsteps, cracking cherry stones. They winked at Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin Bunny. Presently Peter let the pocket handkerchief go again. They got amongst flower pots and frames and tubs. Peter heard noises worse than ever. His eyes were as big as lollipops. He was a step or two in front of his cousins when he suddenly stopped. This is what those little rabbits saw round that corner. Little Benjamin took one look, and then, in half a minute less than no time, he hid himself and Peter and the onions underneath a large basket. The cat got up and stretched herself, and came and sniffed at the basket. Perhaps she liked the smell of onions. Anyway, she sat down upon the top of the basket. She sat there for 5 hours. I cannot draw you a picture of Peter and Benjamin underneath the basket, because it was quite dark, and because the smell of onions was fearful. It made Peter Rabbit and little Benjamin cry. The sun got round behind the wood, and it was quite late in the afternoon, but still the cat sat upon the basket. At length there was a pitter-patter, and some bits of mortar fell from the wall above. The cat looked up and saw old Mr. Benjamin Bunny prancing along the top of the wall of the upper terrace. He was smoking a pipe of rabbit tobacco and had a little switch in his hand. He was looking for his son. Old Mr. Bunny had no opinion whatever of cats. He took a tremendous jump off the top of the wall onto the top of the cat, and cuffed it off the basket, and kicked it into the greenhouse, scratching off a handful of fur. The cat was too much surprised to scratch back. When old Mr. Bunny had driven the cat into the greenhouse, he locked the door. Then he came back to the basket and took out his son Benjamin by the ears and whipped him with the little switch. Then he took out his nephew Peter. Then he took out the handkerchief of onions and marched out of the garden. When Mr. McGregor returned about half an hour later, he observed several things which perplexed him. It looked as though some person had been walking all over the garden in a pair of clogs, only the footmarks were too ridiculously little. Also, he could not understand how the cat could have managed to shut herself up inside the greenhouse, locking the door upon the outside. When Peter got home, his mother forgave him, because she was so glad to see that he had found his shoes and coat. Cottontail and Peter folded up the pocket handkerchief, and old Mrs. Rabbit strung up the onions and hung them from the kitchen ceiling, with the bunch of herbs and the rabbit tobacco. End of The Tale of Benjamin Bunny by Beatrix Potter.
A Winter Adventure by Norma Bright Carson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Betty and Bob had been promised a trip to the country during the Christmas holidays. So 2 days after Christmas, when the excitement of turkey dinners and presents had almost worn away, they made ready to go. Mrs. Meredith took them for a half-hour ride in the train, and then at a tiny little country station they got off and started to walk. First they reached the general store, outside of which several farmers were stamping up and down, their feet wrapped in potato bags to protect them from the frost. The store looked so interesting that Bob wanted to go in, so, in quest of a few candies, they entered. "Pretty cold weather, little feller, I guess?" asked the storekeeper of Bob. "Looks to me 'sif a storm's pretty nigh due." "Oh, do you think so?" exclaimed Mrs. Merideth. "We are planning to take a long walk." "Well, ma'am, I reckon as how you can get back afore it comes along, if you'll hurry up a mite. You're safe for a couple of hours, I guess." Betty and Bob, with their mother, hurried away. Walking for a while, they soon had passed by all the many farmhouses in the town part, and came out along a country road that did not seem to be used much for traveling. It was early in the afternoon, and the sun, while not smiling his brightest, appeared from behind the white clouds every now and then, and almost blinded them. Everywhere the trees were bare. Despite this, they rose majestically and stretched long arms against the sky. Here and there an icicle hung loosely from the limb of a tree, and as they passed the fences, Betty delighted in breaking off the little ones that clung all in rows. The fields looked gray and dismal. All the green grass of a few months before had disappeared, and in its place was brown, dull-colored stubble, sprinkled here and there with a thin coat of frost. How good it felt in the fresh air! As they walked along they drew in long, deep breaths of it. It was cold, but brisk walking made them forget this, and they really felt cozy and warm. Then all at once the sun seemed to run away from them. This time he did not come out to play peek-a-boo, but stayed in altogether. The clouds grew heavier and heavier, and the air became chilly and damp. "I'm afraid that old farmer was right," said Mrs. Merideth. "We must hurry for the train." So they hastened a bit. After walking for some time, however, Mrs. Merideth suddenly stopped short. "I am sure we are going the wrong way," she said. "I do not remember passing that field covered with fertilizer." All three looked anxiously around in search of some familiar landmark, but there was none. Where was the station? Even now a few flakes of snow were falling, and they were all becoming cold. "Well, we cannot stand still," said their mother. "Perhaps we will come to a farmhouse and be able to get a lift." But they walked on and on without finding a trace of any living thing. The snow was now falling thick and fast, and it was hard to walk without overshoes. Betty was quite frightened and began to cry, but Bob cheered her up and said, "Come, buck up, sis. Don't be a baby. We'll soon find some place to stop," and on they went. Mrs. Merideth was plainly worried, for she saw that Betty, who was not very strong, was beginning to give out, and Bob was too young to go alone to hunt for a place of shelter. Then came a sudden gust of wind that threw Betty down. Bob helped her up, but she could no longer pretend to be brave, and she was frankly crying. It was then that Bob discovered a shelter. It was nothing but an abandoned barn, yet it was a protection, so in they went. The snow was now almost blinding in its fury. Suddenly there was the sound of a strange voice and the pounding of horses' hoofs. "Keerful, Bill. Keep her up, old scout. We're most there now." Bob ran to the door and saw an approaching wagon. With difficulty he succeeded in making the farmer understand their troubles, but at last the three of them were helped into the old cart, which was nearly at its journey's end. A short ride and they had reached the farmhouse. As they got off, the door was opened and a motherly woman called out, "Caught in the storm too?" Poor Betty was in a pretty scared state, so they helped her first, rubbing her hands and giving her warm milk to drink. Then the farmer's wife made a good hot country supper for all of them. There was only one thing that bothered Mrs. Merideth, and that was how to let her husband know of their safety. Perhaps something in her face made the farmer's wife understand her anxiety, for she said, "Don't worry, Hiram will see that your folks know where you are. Just leave it to him and make yourself comfortable. I'll have a room made ready for you so you can soon go to bed." At that Hiram entered the room, and his wife told him that in some way he must get into communication with Mr. Merideth. "Just give me the address and I'll telegraph him where you are," said he. So into the storm a few minutes later Hiram went, this time properly clad and on foot. Nearly an hour passed before he returned, but he came back safely. "Got a lift out on Mansion Road," said he. By this time Mrs. Merideth and the children were ready for bed. They soon went to sleep, and it was not until the next morning that they woke to find the snow still falling and the ground entirely white. Late that afternoon, when the storm had somewhat abated, Mr. Meredith arrived with a sleigh. Into this he tucked them warmly, and, with many thanks to the good old farm people, they set out for home. End of A Winter Adventure by Norma Bright Carson. Read by Betty B.